Right. So welcome back everyone to our third panel, our first afternoon panel, and I'll hand things over to Professor Anton Ford, who will be moderating this panel. Professor Ford is Associate Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Chicago. He studies, among other topics, practical philosophy and especially the works of Aristotle, Marx, and Escom. So, Professor Ford.
Hi, welcome everyone. This is the panel on humanities, and we're going to have three speakers who I'll introduce now, and then each will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have an open discussion. The first speaker is Adam Rensch, who is a PhD from UIC in 2022, who teaches now at Bowling Green State. He's the author of No Home for You Here, a memoir of class and culture, 2020, and he's written for The Guardian and Jacobin and is a regular contributor to the field notes sections of the Brooklyn Rail. Our next speaker on the end is Filippo Petricca, who completed his PhD in Romance Studies at the University of Chicago in 2022. He's an assistant professor now in the Department of French and Italian at Indiana University. His main research projects investigate a relationship between literature and economics with a special focus on medieval Italy and France. And currently he's working on a monograph entitled Dante's Divine Economy, and a second book entitled The Virtuous Economy. Finally, in the middle, Catherine Liu is a professor of film and media studies at the University of California, Irvine. She's the author of Virtue Holders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class from 2021, and The American Idol, Academic Anti-Elitism as Cultural Critique in 2011. And she works on old school critical theory and is engaged in a critique of class-driven liberal politics. Adam?
Does this show the, there we go. Does this show the title of the paper? Does it matter? Okay, good, because I don't really like the title. It was just a placeholder, and then I never changed it, so. Much better. Okay. So this is a titleless paper about higher education. Higher education in the United States is in crisis. At least part of it is. Specifically, thank you. Check. All right. Specifically, institutions serving predominantly low-income and working-class students have faced major declines in attendance. From 2010 to 2021, enrollment at public two-year colleges dropped by 37%, from 7.2 million to 4.4 million. At public four-year universities, meanwhile, total undergraduate enrollment fell 15%, from 18.1 million to 15.4 million. These declines vary geographically, with states such as Alaska, Iowa, Michigan, and New Mexico seeing between a 30 and 45% drop in attendance. While the most recent numbers have revealed a slight recovery, the long-term forecast is less optimistic. Due to declining birth rates, the college-age population is expected to peak in the next few years and will likely have decreased by up to 25% by the end of the 2030s. Already struggling 2- and 4-year public institutions, along with smaller private colleges that are highly tuition dependent, will be hit hardest. Especially bleak analyses have predicted that as many as half of these small schools could close by 2040. Added to this demographic cliff, as scholars call it, is a shifting demand cliff, a decline in the number of high school students who choose to pursue higher education immediately after graduation. Since 2010, the immediate enrollment rate has fallen from roughly 70% to 62%, with the overall enrollment rate of 18 to 24-year-olds declining less dramatically from 41% to 38%. So, not only is the college-age population declining, those within this population are also increasingly less likely to view higher education as a viable investment. Many don't view it favorably at all. Only 42% of those between 18 and 34 currently have confidence in higher education, down from 60% in 2015. Nevertheless, the portended crisis hasn't seemed to reach all universities. The total number of individual college applications has continued to grow year over year, especially at elite institutions. Since 2010, applications to all 8 Ivy League schools increased more than 100%, with similar increases at highly selective universities such as Stanford, NYU, Georgetown, and Northwestern. The University of Chicago remarkably increased enrollment by over 30% in the same time period, despite simultaneously slashing the acceptance rate in half from 8.8 to less than 5%. So while these trends might seem somewhat paradoxical, especially given that the exorbitant costs have contributed greatly to declining enrollment broadly, they mirror the larger structure of our finance economy in a few critical ways, and this is kind of the crux of this paper. First, the post-war model of higher education, of expanding access to working people, has been replaced by a university monopoly, one which has retained the language of opportunity and mobility, but functions primarily as a means of reproducing the existing class structure. This is especially obvious with Ivy League and other luxury brands, which operate like a cartel. But it is also true for large state universities that have sought to continuously lower acceptance rates while raising cost of attendance. Second, the intellectual property of a college degree, a form of human capital that one does not, quote, own in a traditional sense, means students are effectively paying for access to the labor market. As a barrier to entry, it represents a form of payment collected by university gatekeepers. This cost, contrary to common belief, is not driven by supply and demand. Rather, it is set by institutions whose primary economic incentive is to maximize revenues, often for endowment investment opportunities. Individual universities, in essence, functions as small monopolies themselves. Third, because education is primarily funded via debt, rent is further collected in the form of monthly payments paid to various institutions of finance capital, banks, loan servicers, owners of student loan asset-backed securities, etc. Finally, academic fealty to the meritocratic success and professional excellence functions as ideological training for the ruling class. Universities accept and rationalize economic inequality even as they champion the rights of the oppressed and pay lip service to quote-unquote first-generation students, which is a term that seems like it was filtered through some HR thing to not have to talk about money. Since the growth of the university after World War II, higher education in the United States has been almost universally equated with social mobility. Most of the data supporting this belief points to income earnings of graduates, which has historically revealed a significant increase in pay for those with a college degree. While it is true that college graduates generally earn more than their less educated peers, existing family income plays a significant role in this discrepancy, along with the educational attainment of one's parents. In essence, children from higher income families with at least one college-educated parent have far better outcomes. As Gary Roth notes in his book, Educated Underclass, these two factors reinforce one another by influencing the decision to pursue higher education, the preparation for this pursuit, and the type of institution one chooses. One study by the National Center for Education Statistics, which analyzed the class of 2013, showed that of the small number of students in the bottom quintile who pursue any sort of a higher education, only 7% applied to highly selective four-year institutions. Another 15% applied to quote-unquote, moderately selective institutions, such as public universities, while 61% enrolled in two-year community colleges or shorter certificate granting programs. At the other end of this income distribution, 78% of students in the top quintile applied to either highly selective or moderately selective institutions. Crucially, 44% of the lowest quintile and 34% of the second lowest quintile never enrolled at all. And many of those who did eventually left. By 2016, only 28% of the bottom quintile was still enrolled. None of this is all that surprising, but the retainment rates are critical because only 1 in 5 students who enroll at open admissions universities graduate within 6 years, compared to 4 in 5 students who enroll at highly selective universities. Outside of nursing schools and other certificate granting programs, the schools with the highest graduation rates, so 95% or better, include all 8 Ivy League universities, MIT, Stanford, University of Chicago, Northwestern, Duke, Williams College, and Notre Dame. The mean income of graduates from these institutions ranges from $74,000 to $124,000, while those who graduate from 2-year or certificate granting programs rarely enjoy median income above $35,000. These numbers, to be sure, largely mirror the family incomes of the students who attend these schools. So what looks like social mobility more often represents the continuity of inheritance and the reproduction of class relations. As Roth puts it, the educational system functions as an inverted funnel through which the class system reproduces itself quite literally. People who go to Harvard or any prestigious institution tend to come from wealthy, educated families with powerful networking connections. Faculty at these universities, similarly, are 50 times more likely than the average person to have a parent with a PhD. People who attend nursing or beauty school may earn more than their less educated parents, but will likely never enter another tax bracket. While Harvard and other Ivy League schools now reserve some 20% of tuition-free enrollment spots for Pell Grant recipients, given the artificial scarcity created and maintained by 5% acceptance rates, few from the working class will ever benefit from this. In fact, the majority of low-income students are negatively impacted by the Ivy League's obsession with prestige, despite some now gaining entry in what amounts to a de facto lottery system. Such prestige is largely quantified by rigorous admission standards, forcing other universities to follow suit in an effort to compete for rankings in the U.S. News and World Report. University of Michigan, for example, cut its acceptance rate from 50% to 20% in recent years, as have a number of other public universities seeking to establish themselves as quasi-luxury brands. To be fair, some of the decrease in acceptance rates is driven by an increase in the number of applications. Individual applicants now apply to more schools at once. So this is driven by the more schools opting into a common app. This is a trend driven in part by hopes of landing a coveted spot at a prestigious university that can afford to offer generous financial aid from its large endowment. Indeed, for low-income students, it is actually more affordable to attend Harvard than many public universities. The average annual cost at Harvard for a student with a family income below $75,000 is $538. At my undergraduate alma mater, Bowling Green State University, which is a bottom-tier institution with an acceptance rate of 79%, the same student would pay at least $10,684 annually. Given that the median income of BGSU graduates is $47,000, this cost represents almost 100% of their future annual earnings. Again, what this reality produces is a credentials lottery that presents itself as a meritocratic reward system, but which functions primarily to reproduce the inequality of existing class structure. As Barron and Sweezy wrote in their 1966 study, Monopoly Capital, people are taught from the earliest childhood and by all conceivable means that everyone has an equal opportunity and that the inequalities which stare them in the face are the result not of unjust institutions, but of their own superior or inferior natural endowments. It would contradict this teaching to set up, in the manner of European class-divided societies, two distinct educational systems, one for the oligarchy and one for the masses. The desired result must be sought indirectly by providing amply for that part of the educational system which serves the oligarchy, while financially starving that part which serves the lower, middle, and working classes. This ensures the inequality of education so vitally necessary to buttress the general inequality, which is the heart and core of the whole system. For Barron and Sweezy, higher education represents one area where the surplus product of monopoly capitalism could be absorbed satisfactorily, much as it is in areas like defense spending. That it isn't, and that the ruling class so vehemently opposes measures like universal free tuition and other forms of truly public education, is precisely because such spending would undermine the class structure. It is far more advantageous to force the working class to compete for limited spots at amply funded elite universities, while reserving acceptance to more costly, less prestigious institutions for the vast majority. For those with means, the cost of an elite education is not an issue. They will gladly pay up for a credential that bestows upon them the status they so richly deserve, and which anyway functions as a kind of Veblen good. It is better precisely because it costs more. To be sure, the wealthiest graduates from the top universities also represent a major donor base, offering an additional revenue stream for increasingly massive endowments. As the NCES notes, at the end of the fiscal year 2021, the market value of endowment funds of colleges and universities was $927 billion. The five largest endowments, which include Harvard, Yale, Stanford, University of Texas, and Princeton, collectively held $210 billion, or 23% of the total market value. Overall, the 20 largest endowments totaled roughly $600 billion, or 65% of the total endowment for all universities and colleges. These tax-free endowments, which are subsidized by taxpayers and run by members of the financial class, provide an annual return through investment in asset markets. More importantly, as Sahaj Sharda notes, the more resources that collect in endowments, the more enticing relationships with these institutions become for hedge fund and private equity firms seeking access to large quantities of capital and the prestige needed to raise even more capital from private markets. These relationships are proudly touted on the website of Princeton Investment Company, Princo. Princo is the name of Princeton's investment company, which notes Princo partners with the best in-class investment management firms across the globe and in diverse asset categories. Much of Princo's success reflects its ability to select and gain access to top-tier managers as well as engage with them constructively. Since 1977, according to its own data, Princeton's endowment investments have earned a compound annualized return of 12.9%. For Sharda, the market power of Ivy League and other elite institutions made possible by increasing seat scarcity comprises a form of monopoly rent. But as he notes, there are no shareholders at these universities. No dividends or share buybacks can get these rents out of the university coffers. Instead, the rents are increasingly captured by a growing bureaucracy of administrators. This growing segment of the professional managerial class is what Barron and Sweezy refer to as surplus eaters, and their relatively useless position within the hierarchy of the university forces them to justify their existence via the creation of campus programs and amenity developments that raise the overall cost burden for students. At elite universities where the 20% of low-income students effectively pay nothing, this cost is passed on to the wealthier students for whom cost is irrelevant. But the growth in administration is certainly not limited to elite institutions. And at less prestigious institutions where the majority of low-income students enroll, the cost is passed on to them via hikes in tuition, fees, and room and board. While the common explanation for the rising cost of higher education utilizes a crude supply and demand analysis, more and more applicants creating a rising demand that strains a limited supply, recent history suggests that demand has little to do with it. Between 2010 and 2021, as enrollment rates declined 15% at public four-year universities, average tuition at these same universities rose 11% when adjusted for inflation. A wider look at these trends is similarly telling and locates the burden more squarely on administrative costs. Between 1976 and 2018, full-time administrators and, quote, other professionals increased by 164% and 452%, respectively. Meanwhile, full-time faculty increased by 92%, student enrollment grew by 78%, and during that same period, tuition grew 142%. Ultimately, despite ostensible, quote, competition between both post-secondary institutions, the price of higher education is set by these institutions themselves. This is very clear in elite institutions, which were, there was an antitrust lawsuit filed against a number of the Ivy League institutions in the 90s because they were basically colluding to set costs. So if somebody was accepted to, say, both Harvard and Yale, they would get together and decide how much financial aid each would give them so that they wouldn't outbid one another and inadvertently lower the cost of the degree. So even after accounting for declining enrollments, the demand for higher education has remained relatively inelastic. So the trouble, of course, is in determining what the, quote, service universities offer ought to cost relative to the cost of its production, an equation complicated by regular changes in government funding that props up the entire industry. Unlike other sectors, for example, agricultural, these subsidies do not seem to meaningfully control price, even as they represent a larger chunk of governmental spending. A similar issue arises when considering the value in monetary terms of a college degree, an asset that represents an accumulation of knowledge and experience acquired over a several-year span. As a form of human capital, it can't be resold or transferred to someone else. Rather, its value is considered in terms of return on investment, i.e., the future earnings you would not have earned otherwise. Given that virtually everyone agrees this degree is necessary for higher earnings, even if this is increasingly less guaranteed in reality, institutions of higher education function as gatekeepers, collecting payment in return for access. It's debatable whether these payments are rent in a factual sense, and likewise unclear what it would mean to call them unearned income, given their nonprofit status. But nevertheless, the gatekeeping function of universities is self-evident. Where rents clearly do come into play is in the student loan market. Each year, roughly 40% of incoming undergraduate students receive student aid in the form of loans, and overall 55% of undergraduates have borrowed at some point during the course of their degree. Students enrolled in graduate programs borrow more frequently, with 60% of master's students and 75% of doctoral candidates carrying student debt. In 2020, total student debt reached $1.7 trillion, which represented nearly 10% of total national consumer debt. That has since fallen to $1.6 trillion, congrats to Joe Biden, with recent forgiveness initiatives. But while the number of conferred undergraduate degrees each year is more than double the number of graduate degrees, roughly half of all student debt is owed by graduate students. Unlike undergraduate loans, which are capped at $31,000 for dependent students and $57,000 for independent students, graduate loans are not constrained. The Federal Graduate Plus loan created in 2005, used by many to cover tuition and cost of living, has no fixed limit on how much grad students can borrow. And this is from a 2018 report by the GAO, which found, quote, as of June 30th, 2017, the median borrow of Graduate Plus loans, federal loans made to graduate or professional students to pay for educational expenses not covered by other financial aid, had taken out over $140,000 in federal student loans, which includes Grad Plus, undergraduate, and other graduate loans. This amount includes a total of nearly $27,000 in Grad Plus loans. From award years 2007 through 2017, the Department of Education disbursed approximately $71 billion in Grad Plus loans to about 1.7 million unique borrowers. Individual Grad Plus borrowing amounts range from about 5,000 at the 10th percentile of borrowers to 98,554 at the 90th percentile of borrowers. So overall, graduate debt has risen sharply since 1995, when total graduate enrollment was roughly 2 million, and the total amount of graduate student debt was 61 billion. By 2017, graduate debt had increased more than 1,000% to 634 billion, while total enrollment had increased 33% to roughly 3 million. Much like undergraduate degrees, the cost of graduate school has more than doubled in the last 3 decades. In 95, a master's degree cost $5,874. That's adjusted for inflation. By 2020, the same degree reached $12,394. Today, graduates with a master's degree have $80,494 in debt on average. PhD graduates have an average of $132,268. These balances are compounded by the fact that Grad Plus loans typically have an origination fee, which is currently 4.228%, and have a significantly higher interest rate, currently 8.05%, than undergraduate Stafford loans, which are 5.5%. That extra 3%, 2.5% is quite a bit of interest, especially if you have a large principal balance. Given the increasing prevalence of the undergraduate degree, which has inflated its value on the labor market, a graduate degree is necessary to remain competitive in many professional fields. As a 2019 report by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics notes, occupations that typically require a master's degree, smallest group in terms of base year employment in 2016, are projected to grow at a rate of 16.7% through 2026. That's more than twice the rate of growth projected for all occupations, 7.4%. The second fastest growing group of occupations is those that typically require a doctoral or professional degree for entry. And while those with graduate degrees often earn higher salaries, humanities graduates excluded, a portion of salary in question passes into the hands of whichever, quote, servicer has been assigned to manage loan payments, figurative interest payments, which are themselves paying toward literal accruing interest. Unsurprisingly, some of these loans are being used as economic instruments in the financial sector under the poetically cryptic acronym SLABS, Student Loan Asset-Backed Securities. So while the person whose name is attached to the college degree may not package it and sell it on the market, asset management corporations certainly can. Fortunately, federal loans issued after 2010 can't be securitized anymore, but those on the private market can. So if any of you guys have ever received an email from SoFi or whoever asking you to refinance, that's who's kind of at the forefront of all this. At just 7.5% of total student debt as of 2023, private loans comprise $130 billion in assets. At this point, it seems clear that there is something quite feudal or neo-feudal about the higher education system, not only in its costs and hierarchical structure, but in the reality it has made for millions of adults whose debt-to-income ratio now prevents them from things like securing a mortgage, forcing them to instead rely on actual landlords. Of course, this is also true for those who choose to not attend a college and remain in the large, precarious population of wage laborers. But this only serves to highlight the essential point. Higher education is a central player in the reproduction of class relations as they exist under capitalism. While it can and does raise the standard of living for a certain portion of the population, this portion is much smaller than is commonly believed. For those who do make it, say one of the few hundred poor kids who attend Harvard each year on a full ride, the educational system is the last thing they would think to critique. After all, it worked for them. And more importantly, it needs to work for them. Every viable class society, as Baron Sweezy wrote, must provide a method by which brains and talent from the lower classes can be selected, used by, and integrated into the upper classes. Or, as Marx put it more directly, the more ruling class is able to assimilate the most prominent men of a ruled class, the more solid and dangerous is its rule. In this light, and this is the final point, we might add that higher education as it is structured today performs an additional ideological function by reproducing the cultural relations that help to rationalize inequality as the result of natural endowments, as Barron and Sweezy describe it. This is certainly true for prominent conservatives, conservative critics like Michael Lind, who writes of a managerial overclass, and Joel Kotkin, who in his 2020 book, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, argues for the existence of a modern clerisy that includes teachers, consultants, lawyers, government workers, and medical providers. This clerisy, he writes, and this is all him, tend to believe themselves more enlightened than the average person on attitudes about the family, for example, and seek to impose their own standards through the media, the education system, and various arenas of cultural production. Their judgment about such issues as race relations and white privilege can be even more unforgiving than traditional religious teaching on homosexuality, divorce, or birth control. People who venture outside of the, quote, correct worldview may be made to feel they have committed a kind of original sin for which they can ask forgiveness, but will nevertheless remain excommunicated. Kotkin's argument, in essence, aligns with broader right-wing populist frustration toward the micromanagement of everyday life. Given the role of higher education in the promotion and teaching of things like DEI initiatives and the elite credentials held by many in power, it offers a highly visible object of critique. But many left-wing critics have offered similar analyses indirectly and indirectly. In his 2018 paper, Brahmin Left versus Merchant Right, Rising Inequality in the Changing Structure of Political Conflict, Thomas Piketty writes that the major structural cleavage defining American politics since 1980 is between an educated, self-defined left and the wealthy elites of the right. As he puts it, the left has become the party of the intellectual elite, or the Brahmin left, while the right can be viewed as the party of the business elite, the merchant right. His use of the word Brahmin as a caste label echoes Kotkin's neo-feudal analysis. And what both are articulating is a cultural and political hierarchy that ignores fundamental issues of economic exploitation by reframing power relations as problems of individual traits, beliefs, talents, motivations, self-discipline, etc. In their influential critiques of identity politics, Walter Ben Michaels and Adolph Reed similarly have argued that this division represents the left and right wings of neoliberalism. Indeed, the highly reactionary and authoritarian response from many universities and media outlets to the present situation in Gaza is stark proof that higher education can offer few meaningful challenges to inequality and suffering playing out on a global scale. To return in closing to the claim that higher education in the United States is in crisis, we might consider what such a crisis represents. For those embedded in the system, this crisis represents an impending loss of revenue, as well as a public relations problem for how best to market its service to an increasingly suspicious population. Ongoing hikes in tuition and fees are certainly one option, but it seems like this will eventually reach a limit. People can only pay so much, and with few signs of reversing decades of wage stagnation, it's unclear how much the wealthiest among us may be fine paying whatever a degree will cost in 2040, but for the vast majority of working people, higher education may simply cease to represent a viable investment. For these individuals, the crisis in higher education represents something far bleaker, namely the loss of the primary avenue they've been told will provide them with a better standard of living. While this certainly seems dystopian from our present vantage point, with any luck or hope, it will provide a catalyst for the working class to fight for a different path, one that actually delivers on its promise. Thank you.
Okay, so hello, everybody. I wanted to say that I'm super happy to be here. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to cross different disciplines and to get the chance to discuss from the humanities to the social sciences to law studies. So I'm super excited to be here. And I wanted to thank Eduardo and Nico, of course, and everybody else who's contributing to the organization and to make it work. So thanks so much. So So today we started off with a problematic definition of capitalism, right? According to Morozov. So my talk is going to be on the problematic definition of feudalism. So kind of complementary. So what is exactly neo-feudalism and what is its relationship with medieval feudalism? And what can medieval literature do to help us complicate our understanding of economic history? So my talk today will offer a few, hopefully provocative answers to these questions. I wish to clarify from the very outset that rather than offering guidelines to examine the present, I'm not an expert in modern capitalism or an economic historian. I wish to reconstruct how and when feudalism came to be in order to examine the categories of the present. So I intend to show that the ideas upholding neo-feudalism, and consequently its implied representation of the Middle Ages, are ways to legitimize modern ideas rather than description of the actual past. In other words, the label medieval feudalism, and this is my main claim today, reflects the urge to create a dividing line between a backward past and modern present, a contrast between a credulous, superstitious, hierarchical, stateless medieval period and the secular, capitalist, urban, advanced modernity. So in the last few years, the definition of neo or techno-feudalism has generated a stimulating discussion on modern capitalism. With a few exceptions, and I'm thinking about Morozov that who we quoted earlier today, scholars have argued that the 21st century witnessed a metamorphosis that altered industrial capitalism, transforming it into something else. Even though they use the term neo-feudalism or techno-feudalism or digital feudalism to identify different phenomena, and I will come back to this point in just a moment, these interpreters share an emphasis on progress. In their view, neo-feudalism characterizes a backward movement, a regression into the medieval past that embodies the unfair and exploitative nature of contemporary economics. So to give you a few examples, for Jody Dean, neo-feudalism encompasses, and I quote, a prolonged stagnation and upward redistribution by political means, a direct and personal form of domination of few barons benefiting from a mass of users, which are turned into a new class of servants. Joel Kotkin interprets neo-feudalism as a fall into the obscure and superstitious past, resulting from the fall of the Roman Empire and the barbarian invasions, an obstacle to social mobility, buttressed by a new class of intellectuals, we mentioned that in the previous talk, who, like the medieval clergy, supports the agenda of the globalized markets, acting like a modern reincarnation of the Inquisition, which, by the way, was a much larger phenomenon in early modernity than in the Middle Ages. So just so that you know. Yanis Varoufakis, in 2024, the monograph Techno-Feudalism, reads Techno-Feudalism as the transformation of markets into fiefdoms, profits into rents. And about this, you can also see Durand's notion of seigneurial levy, users into serfs, owners of the means of production into vassals, with cloud capital at its top. For Catherine Stone and Robert Kanner, the emergence of private justice controlled by private corporations is the distinctive feature of neo-feudalism, with the giant fiefdoms of the Silicon Valley visually embodying the new ruling class isolation. In some cases, such as Mariana Mazzucato's contributions on digital feudalism, the meaning of feudalism is not even explained, but basically taken for granted. So in these contributions, feudalism is a stepping stone towards the achievement of progress, either following the alignment, an anti-modern space where to situate all the enemies of the modern state, or maybe echoing Marx's interpretation that has had a considerable impact on the notion of neo-feudalism, a transition to a modern industrialization. And the Middle Ages are the main target of such reconstructions and the necessary foundation stone of this narrative. Ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, the Renaissance are all sidelined on the winning side of history, with the medieval period emerging as a historical parenthesis that arrested human society in its path to liberation. So the main problem with this narrative is that historians of the Middle Ages have severely debunked the notion of feudalism. And here I'm giving you three main examples: Elizabeth Brown's essay from 1974, The Tyranny of a Construct, the monograph by Susan Reynolds, and finally the monograph of Caitlin Davis. And those are all great contributions that I highly recommend, and also my main sources for the historical reconstruction. So these scholars have argued that feudalism is a modern invention that doesn't reflect any actual medieval historical context. And even historians who made the category of feudalism famous, such as Mark Bloch in 1939, acknowledged that the term was, and I quote, very ill chosen, end of quote. And in the following decades, when historians of the Middle Ages adopted feudalism, they did it to describe very different things. For example, feudalism characterized legal agreements between vassals and lords in Charlemagne's empire, and that's 8th century, or in the Masonry region in southern France, but only after the 11th century. So southern France in a different period. Even if we use feudalism to describe a specific set of relations between lords and vassals or lords and peasants, it is important to keep in mind that the Middle Ages lasted, according to this reconstruction, for 1,000 years. There is no stable economic or political structure active for 1,000 years, and for an area that extends from modern Portugal to modern Russia, basically. So, of course, this is not to say that forms of exploitation or personal justice didn't exist. But cases of limited freedom were also present in the ancient world, and in what now is considered early modernity or modernity. And so they were not limited to feudalism. And then they're singled out when we speak about the Middle Ages. And so they become the trademark of the Dark Ages. And the idea that in the Middle Ages, there were three classes, for instance, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, is actually a sweeping generalization. In the medieval period, there were nobles, merchants, priests, artisans, doctors, lawyers, merchants, peasants, serfs, and slaves. Bloch himself, when making examples of feudal agreements in his book, The Feudal Society, mentions painters and goldsmiths as owners of land. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, commerce never fully stopped. Cities remained active. Money was present, even though in different currencies and often not in large amounts. The legal agreements between lords and peasants were not always exploitative. Sometimes land agreements were beneficial to both parties. Sometimes peasants were paid in kind or with money, and they could leave the land which they were supposed to work. Sometimes their lords paid tithes to the church. Sometimes merchants obtained exemptions or special privileges. So how could all these practices be labeled as feudal? Let's try to be more specific. The word feudalism and the idea of a feudal society didn't really exist in the Middle Ages. It was invented in the 18th century and promoted by philosophers like Montesquieu and Voltaire. The word feudum, fief, did exist in the medieval period, but meant very different things. And still in 1630, a French dictionary defines it as lawyer's jargon. Starting from the 18th century, the word became more flexible, moving from a general concept of ownership of the land and the relational obligation to a defining feature of the medieval society. So how did such a diverse spectrum turn into a uniform definition for the entire Middle Ages? Perhaps unsurprisingly, at this point of this talk, this story does not begin in the Middle Ages. In the 16th century, French jurists at the service of the king, such as Charles de Moulins, were investigating a collection of local laws, the Libri Feudorum, dating from 12th century northern Italy, so very specific. In this moment, legal scholars who lived after the Middle Ages posited that this collection was the legacy of the Franks, so one of those barbarians that also Veblen was mentioning earlier today. They didn't claim that those were debased medieval laws. And yet, by commenting on their structure and extending their reach to the early Middle Ages, they paved the way for future interpretations. So in the 18th century, the Enlightenment philosophy picked feudalism as their antagonist, dominating over centuries of economic, religious, and political chaos. A stateless and lawless society characterized by feudal anarchy and personal relationships was the antithesis of modern France, based on the primacy of reason. In the same years, Adam Smith interpreted feudal chaos as antithetical to the progress of commerce. And in the 19th century, emphasizing the Lord's exploitations of peasants, Karl Marx confirmed that feudalism was a parenthesis between antiquity and modernity, as well as a necessary stage in the development of all human society. So we could think that such a reconstruction is very distant from neo-feudalism, from today. But in fact, it isn't. And I will give you one example. A print summarizes the notion of feudalism in the cover page of Joel Coxkin's The Coming of Neo-Feudalism. It is entitled, "We Must Hope This Game Will Be Over Soon." It represents an exhausted peasant carrying on his shoulders a member of the clergy and an aristocrat. The member of the clergy wears a cross hanging from his neck, and a few papers overflowing from his pockets certify his titles: bishop, abbot, duke, and count. Embracing the member of the clergy from behind, we find an aristocrat/warrior with his sword, his medal of honor, and papers that identify his revenues from salt and tobacco, tithes, taxes, and exploitative labor imposed on serfs. The two smiling figures look up, and the peasant carrying their weight looks down. Behind his back, two rabbits eat the fruits of the land. The caption wishes this state of things to be over. We must hope this game will be over soon. The third estate, buttressing the lazy upper classes, is a prelude to the abolition of the feudal laws, a despicable relic from a haunting medieval past. And here's a slightly different version of the print with female worker. So the same kind of structure applied with different gender. So as you may have realized, this famous print is not medieval. It dates to 1789, the year of the French Revolution, and of the abolition of the Ancien Regime. And the characters represented are not medieval peasants, knights, or the Pope. That feudal society, based on a rigid class system with the clergy and the aristocracy at its peak, was an invention of the 18th century. So modern philosophers who were contesting their own times thus projected the feudal age onto the barbaric and backward past in order to glorify their revolutionary present. Such a movement of self-legitimation coexisted with many contradictions. It was possible to claim that a moneyless society was backward only if money was thought as an evolution of barter and gift economies. That a centralized state was necessarily better than a fragmented one only from the perspective of modern governments. That credit was banned and the church impeded the medieval economy only from the perspective of the free markets. In other words, rather than describing medieval practices or societal structure in an accurate way, these assumptions disclose the modern interpreter's urge to create and foster a new narrative of progress. Models of periodization are analytical devices, and yet they also imply and are the product of relationships of power. Periodization do not only describe historical objects, they include also and exclude social and political actors. And the making of medieval feudalism is, of course, no exception. Weaponized to describe the Middle Ages as inherently anti or pre-modern, feudalism became an abstract category to be applied to every form of primitive economy. So pre-capitalist Japan was feudal, with the samurai presented as European knights. sometimes is even as proto-gangsters. China was feudal before Mao's revolution in Mao's words, and after the revolution, when the Chinese Communist Party defined the Cultural Revolution as, quote, feudal fascism. And moreover, as Kathleen Davis and others have demonstrated, the making of the feudal Middle Ages developed alongside the characterization of other areas of the world as underdeveloped or primitive. So by distancing themselves from an exploitative economic and political system relegated to their own past, basically, interpreters, or better said, the makers of the Middle Ages, legitimize also their leading role in the path to civilizing distant lands, perceived as superstitious, irrational, and economically underdeveloped. In other words, feudalism was not just a ghost emerging from the European past, a premise and an antagonist to modern capitalism. It was also a justification to supposedly enlighten other obscure corners of the world. So, literary studies, especially in relationship with economics, haven't been immune from the effects of such periodization. On the one hand, scholars subscribe to the view of the Middle Ages as a pre- or anti-modern space. And if the medieval economy was unsophisticated, well, economics in literary texts had to be irrelevant too. And when they analyze fiction and economics together, scholars highlighted either feudal relationships or gift-giving, or retraced sparkles of modern capitalism in literary texts focusing on the upcoming rise of the bourgeoisie. So they were reading literary texts trying to find out figures of merchants that could serve as proto-bourgeois. The condemnation of avarice and greed were often signs of the corruption or poignant presence of the church, obsessed with usury and acting as an extinguisher of the flame of commerce. At the same time, pondering the posture of many medieval writers who advertised their disdain for commerce, literary scholars assumed that their universe was not contaminated by money, a position that resonates with contemporary agonistic attitudes in the humanities against modern economics and the social sciences, and that's why it's particularly precious that we're having this conversation today. And yet, as my research and that of many others reveal, medieval literary texts engage constantly with complex economic matters. So today, in the final section of my talk, I will offer just an example of how the medieval literary imagination can help us complicate the notion of feudalism. My case study is the Roman de la Rose, one of the most famous allegorical poems of the Middle Ages. The Rose was begun by Guillaume de Loris and completed probably in Paris by Jean de Meun around 1275, so we are in the 13th century. The storyline is seemingly simple. There's a lover who is both the protagonist and the narrator of the story, and he dreams about a flower, the rose, and wants to win her love. To successfully complete this mission, he needs the help of the god of love. The Roman de la Rose presents the god of love as the lord of the protagonist, according to a very specific ritual recounted in detail. The lover joins his hand with the hand of the lord, and you can see it from its medieval illumination, declare his loyalty to the god of love, and finally, they kiss each other on the mouth, with the lover declaring himself a vassal, a ritual that resonates quite specifically and quite precisely with how Marc Bloch describes feudalism in his famous monograph, The Feudal Society. However, the word of the protagonist in the text is not enough to secure the deal with the god of love. Frequently deceived by his former partners, the god of love requires collateral, a pawn that will seal the agreement and protect his investment. And here I read from the English translation. Then he, meaning the god of love, asked me for sureties. My friend, he said, I have received the homage of many men who have since disappointed me. Thanks to an imaginative solution, the god of love obtains the lover's heart as collateral to guarantee a loan. So acting like a pawnbroker who secures the possession of his borrower, the god of love seals the lover's heart with a key to preserve it in his coffers. So promises are not enough, he says. Words are just words, and therefore a special object ensures the successful conclusion of the narrative. This brief excerpt, which has many implications on which I don't have time to focus today, shows that what we may consider a standardized feudal relationship is in fact a combination of multiple layers, embracing political commitment as well as economic practices of medieval Europe. First, the nature of the agreement between the lover and the god of love, the lord and the vassal, is not clear. There's no obligation on the part of the lover, but to maintain his trust in very general terms, the same trust that is present in every exchange between traders or in every form of partnership. Secondly, the god of love is not just the protector of his client, asking him to join the military. He is also a pawnbroker securing the deal. It may be surprising to find a pawnbroking scene in a poem that is considered an example of poorly literature. And yet in 13th century Europe, when the supply of coins was low, people frequently pledged objects to obtain ready money. And pawnbroking was not limited to petty lenders. Even prominent international bankers, knights, or nobles granted secured loans. And yet, even if the Roman de la Rose interacts with its historical context, it is not just its reproduction. What I want to argue here is that fiction transforms historical realities. And in this case, the exchange between the god of love and the lover helps readers experience the fragility of the relationship between creditors and debtors. But the outcome of the narrative confirms that the text admits that debt can be beneficial to both partners. So the rose shows that it is possible to imagine pawnbrokers as opposed to the reputation of their modern counterparts, not as exploitative lords, but as performers of a virtuous service for the community. And again, this is not to say that this was always the case in the Middle Ages. Often lawmakers intervened to regulate the pawnbrokers' activities, and the conditions asked by lenders were unbearable for the borrower. But in general, creditors and debtors were part of the same world, and their relationship reinforced the social fabric. Literary texts imagine virtual universe in which, to project human preoccupations, they offer opportunities to imagine experiences without necessarily providing prescriptive guidelines. In the Rose's fictional universe, which embraces contradiction and ambivalence, the Lord is both a military ally and a pawnbroker. And an agreement between the Lord and vassal can simultaneously activate economic practices and political liaison. So in the form of literary texts or conceptual categories, fictions have an impact on the life of their interpreters. Medieval literary texts address economic matters, problem of monetary quantification, and just price, generating readers' reactions and inviting them to make difficult moral and economic choices. Instead of a backward fictional universe characterizing a pre-modern, unsophisticated economic system, medieval literature invites us to complicate our assumptions, showing us how even imagined rituals of homage absorb and refashion multi-layered experiences, how every human society in its historical context, as well as in its imagined forms, is ultimately a complex artifact. So by reproposing the narrative of medieval feudalism and neo-feudalism alongside the close reading of a literary text, my intention hasn't been to question the content of current economic analysis. Drawing from my expertise in medieval studies and medieval literature, what I wanted to do is to unveil the implication of our categories by looking at the meaning and history of the word we use. In my view, as the case of feudalism proves, our labels often reveal more about the subjects of the present than about the objects of the past. To be sure, in simplifying generalizations and recycling the categories of the past, especially with concepts with such a bad reputation like feudalism, there might be something to gain in terms of immediacy and effectiveness. And yet, as I hope to have shown today, in such a moment, there's also and always something to lose as well. Thank you.
Yeah, yes.
So while he's getting that set up, I'm going to say that I'm going to do what Filippo exactly said not to do. Yes, that's it. No, because I was also trained in the early modern period. I wrote my dissertation in French in the French 17th and 18th centuries. And certain things that you do, like complicate and historicize, I will dialectically oppose with theorize and negate even. Because the thing is that I find that a lot of medievalists end up doing this, and this is why I left the study of the early modern period, is that they come to the modernists and they say, we know better. And this is much more complicated than you think. And of course, I do think that in the end, what you're trying to do rhetorically is redeem feudalism, which is not something I think we should do. You say that we use it incorrectly, but there is no way that feudalism should be redeemed or can be redeemed, but should be understood as a mode of production that was overcome violently. And one of the things that I was going to do today is talk about an intermediate period of time, which was the time period that, in which I wrote my dissertation, the 17th and 18th century in France, the court society. And I do want to talk about the civilization barbarism dialectic, because it was during this period of time when civilization became truly codified. And it's the great Marxist, early modernist, Norbert Elias, who really gave me the guidepost to do this. It was not a popular book in French studies, even though I think he was a great reader of not literature, but marginalia incidentalia, Erasmus's De Civilitate Morum Puerilium, which was a 16th century text written for the education of the prince. So it's sort of the opposite of Machiavelli in that it is about teaching a prince manners. And so the other thing that I think makes me disillusioned about literary studies is one always goes to the literary text for the most complicated text, Le Roman de la Rose, for example. But what Elias did was he showed how to situate literature within more prescriptive political and even educational texts written for a prince. So Machiavelli is the prince, is the one that we all know from the Middle Ages, but this is the actual name of my paper, which I gave Daniel a working title, but I have my doubts about the use of the term techno-feudalism. I come to it very belatedly. I've been working on a project on trauma. I'm finishing up the book that is just called Traumatized, and it'll be out with Verso, I hope, by next year. But I've also been thinking a lot about the protocols of a decadent, of the decline of liberalism in the American empire. And I've been thinking about how this performative self-fashioning that we can take from, Stephen Greenblatt's study of the early modern period has really become the political activity of the professional liberal classes. This self-fashioning, in my darkest moments, I call the woke Baroque, because the Baroque arises when we no longer have belief, when there's a complete crisis in belief in Europe, in God, and the Baroque sort of excess, both sculpturally, in music, in architecture, seems to be, the equivalent of the lady doth protest too much in proclaiming and exclaiming dedication and devotion to God. So one of the things that I feel that we do lack, and here I do agree with Filippo, is a truly deeply historicized sense of of the European legacy. We are so quick right now to decolonize everything. We don't even know what we're decolonizing right now because we have no sense of the epic historical struggles that have brought us to late capitalism, finance capitalism, neo-feudalism, whatever you like. So I do feel like, you know, we're surrounded by these medieval prints in this room here. And one of the great battles that I think we need to enjoin, Adam has shown us that the university may not be the place to do this, is actually the battle for an epic sense of history, a popular epic historical materialism that can exceed these walls, that can educate the working class, that can profoundly transmit to the people of the working class their share in the building of this history, of the historical legacy and the achievements of the historical legacy. And I think that's what is most profound to me about historical materialism. So I am, you know, I like to exercise the tradition of the polemic here, so excuse me. But not in a Zizekian way. Oh yes, now I'm going to talk about now I'm going to talk about an advertisement of sadomasochism. No, I'm not. Okay, so I'm going to read the first. I'm going to read what I prepared, and then I'm going to go through the slides. So, Norbert Elias, one of the great historical materialists of the early 20th century, of the mid 20th century, I should say, wrote in his History of Manners and its class content during the French 17th and 18th centuries, I quote here, stylistic conventions, the forms of social intercourse, affect molding, esteem for courtesy, the importance of good speech and conversation, articulateness of language, and much else, all this is first formed in France within courtly society, then slowly changes in a continuous diffusion from a social into a national character. And I think that he's, you know, in this, you know, paragraph, sort of talking about how the notion of civilization among the nobility emerges in the French 17th century at a period of time when feudalism is falling. So here's the thing that I want us to think about through the court society is how does the absolute monarchy put an end to a period, a mode of production, a period of political domination, and bring about something new. So maybe I'm doing this thing that Filippo said, which is, you know, creating a proto-bourgeoisie. But what Elias says is the French bourgeoisie, the French merchant class, and the French nobility were both much more in contact with each other throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, so that the French bourgeoisie assumes the civilizing missions and the civilizing etiquette, if you like, of the nobility of Louis XIV in order to create this national character that will become even a defining principle in the Enlightenment era and the violent overthrow of the monarchy that is the French Revolution. Because knowing how to speak properly, knowing how to be in public, knowing how to please were rhetorical moves that were pioneered, standardized, regularized within the court of Louis XIV. Of course, there were many courts throughout the Middle Ages, where the early modern period in Europe, but they were fragmented, and none were as consolidated, aspirational, ambitious to universal principles as Louis XIV's court. And in fact, if I was a dance historian, I would talk about ballet as this kind of being pioneered there, but I'm not. The court society of the 17th century developed under Louis XIV as a critical part of the consolidation of power of the absolute monarchy, completed the taming of the feudal aristocracy by removing the nobility from their fiefdoms and their vassals, by seducing them with favors and privileges, tax collections, entertainment, emollients of power in a centralized location, the courts of Paris and Versailles. Separated from their vassals, their ancestral lands, and the source of their wealth and power, in fact, the French nobility developed as the bourgeois intelligentsia would in the following century, a refined, highly stylized mode of being under surveillance that would be increasingly rational, disciplined, and while meaning to please a tyrant and an absolute monarch, deeply political. This is what Elias says is very different from the French bourgeoisie of the 18th century. They understood themselves as political actors because in the court society, power and competition for power was one of the undergirding I would say competition for symbolic power to please the monarch was one of the undergirding principles of noble life. So you have the Dukes of Bourgogne, the Dukes of Dijon, the Dukes of Alsace, all gathered in Versailles and in Paris, absentee landlords precisely, no longer rewarded for their physical domination of an area, of a fiefdom, and submitting to an extremely controlled and highly surveilled environment. And so I'm going to do that like terrible thing that, you know, French early modernists don't want us to do, but I think is important to do so that we can understand the significance of our historical precedents, is that there's a kind of compulsion, a soft compulsion to be at court and submit to surveillance if you're a member of the nobility. And this soft compulsion to surveillance, I think, has really been embodied by the structures of surveillance capitalism, as theorized by Shoshana Zuboff. You know, cloud capitalism, Varoufakis talks about in a way that is interesting, but I think all of these accounts do miss this struggle, the struggle for the demise of feudalism and its replacement with something else. And there are many, many complex forms of monetary exchange in the Middle Ages up until the 17th century, but it is also at this time that the French national currency is standardized under the livre tournois, which was a new coin and which would be exchangeable for a fixed amount of grain, a fixed amount of linen. This is an important step in terms of rationalization of the exchange relation. And Marx admired the bourgeoisie for having, and he admired the absolute monarch actually for having changed the modes of production so deeply and changed the ways that people were and the ways that people were together. So here we go. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've been over the years, and I haven't been writing this down, but I really would like to think about how the courtier of the court society, beautifully theorized by Elias already in the mid-20th century, evolves into the bureaucrat of this nation state, evolves into the professional of the technocracy of the 20th century, each serving dominant powers, the monarch, the nation state, industrial capitalism, and finally finance capitalism. So when I wrote the book about the professional managerial class, it was very, very much deeply informed by my reading of early modern texts, among them, not only in French, but Walter Benjamin's theory of the Trauerspiel, of the tragedy and the tragic nature of the courtier in the German mourning play. Why is it? Okay, this is just very eccentric intellectual history. Okay. So I'm trying to take up Varoufakis's later arguments, however, as a thought experiment, in order to explore the ways in which what Elias called affect molding under techno-feudalism has returned the professional, all of us, to our feudal origins and made of its aspirations a farcical performance of submission and virtue. Because this was what Benjamin talked about. This is what a lot of the contemporaries of the court society, like La Rochefoucauld and La Hourbert, talked about, that you have men and women of talent and intelligence needing to find a way to submit to an indifferent, cold, cruel, but absolute monarch. And this kind of thought is also theorized by another great Marxist of the French early modern period, Lucien Goldman, who talks about the tragic nature of Christian belief in the 17th century. The God, his book, The Hidden God, the Dieu Caché, is really about Pascal trying to think about how we intellect faith with a God who is indifferent and tolerant of evil. And so you have this idea of the courtier then as a tragic figure. I want to say that the professional today, as Adam has described, is an opportunist, is a lumpen figure who is in the wrong genre, who is in a tragic genre, was deluded, like one of his false aspects of false consciousness. Maybe this goes for all of us who have retirement benefits that are managed by Blackstone and Vanguard, is like, we think we're heroes and enlighteners, but we're actually farcical puppets in a tragedy. And this is the Pascalian view. And this was also the Goldmanian view from a Marxist point of view, and this is Marx's view about how men make history behind their backs. Okay, so sorry about this. The genre that I think is the optimistic genre is actually the picaresque genre, but I'm not, that's another story. That's the genre of the entrepreneur. I just had this great idea. I fell down and someone gave me $200 million. This is so great. It's like more deeply ingrained than the even than the meritocratic myth, is that they have this notion of luck and being blessed. So if we are to talk about the emergence of techno-feudalism as a replacement for capitalism, as Varoufakis suggests, I think it would behoove us to look at the works of 20th century Marxists like Elias and Lucien Goldman, who analyzed the early modern period and the pre-revolutionary Ancien Regime to see if the ideological epiphenomena or superstructure of domination from that period can be identified in our contemporary ways of being and our institutions. So it was in the sphere of 17th century court society that new forms of affect molding were actually pioneered that would later be adapted by the rising bourgeoisie. Elias compares the French aristocracy's relative adaptability to power with the German nobility's inability to adopt these new ways of being, and alludes to the blood and soil attachments of the German nobility, which was opposed to the democratizing and rationalizing impulses of the French nobility as a condition of the progressiveness of absolute monarchy. The French intelligentsia of the 18th century believed in the refinement and improvement of manners adopted and inherited from the court society. In Rousseau, however, the denunciation of courtliness, politeness, and what is called civilization against barbarie was translated by the German middle-class intelligentsia into a defense of true virtue against artificiality and courtliness. This is the advent of German Romanticism and German idealism. The defense of virtue in response to the sociability of forms of knowledge represented for Elias a bourgeois radicalism that was born of the political powerlessness of the German intelligentsia. And once again, this kind of reminds me of the political powerlessness of the professional liberals, or what we call just contemptuously the rad libs. The more powerless and divorced we are from the courts of power, the more elaborate our forms of etiquette and civil and behavior. The more tightly we police our apperceptive intersubjective relations. So there was in the 17th century also an entire alternative language of love and sentimentality that was pioneered by women of the salons. It was ridiculed by Molière as Les Précieuses Ridicules. And one of the things that I think that people miss, or, one of the ways in which we could understand this protocol of political correctness or wokeness that, the right tries to denounce, is that it is a kind of language, it's a just new language of emotions and sentiments imposed from the outside in. This female-dominated salon culture did bear fruit in the 18th century in the ascendancy of Romanticism and its new print cultures, the novel and newspaper, sentimental novel on one hand and newspapers on the other, of which Rousseau, and these sentimental novels, Rousseau wrote a few. Scenes of private suffering, detailed accounts of one's inner life as a child, and a brutal honesty about one's economic and social station produced a mode of melodramatic and autobiographical confession whose features remain with us today, disseminated across social media as passes to recognition and visibility. Melodrama as a genre grew out of the bourgeoisie's understanding of itself as more virtuous and less dominated by feudal codes than the old nobility. Although Rousseau gave the language of authenticity an enlightening imprimatur, melodrama as a genre is not revolutionary. Its opposite mode of representation might be the revolutionary leaps made in accounting, insurance, and financial speculation with the cold, impersonal forms of calculation that the affectual and that became the affectual and dialectical opposite of the popular and lachrymose scenes of prodigal sons and violated maidens, so popular across Europe at the time of the 18th century. So this affect molding that took place reproduced the ideological conditions of the transition from the old regime, we can't call it feudalism, to a kind of mercantile capitalism. And it is a tortured and complex project. It includes many bourgeois types, including innocent victims and predatory villains that we'll see repeated across the language of liberalism today, because liberalism does not recognize itself as performing in the melodramatic genre. So now I've kind of set this up for trauma culture. So although Varoufakis talks about I'm going to read the slide. Although Varoufakis talks about the dispossession of enclosure producing the Industrial Revolution, I think he neglects the primitive accumulation engineered in the early aughts of subjectivity itself. I'm willing to engage in his thought experiment regarding the fall of capitalism in favor of techno-feudalism, but I'm going to offer some thoughts about techno-feudalism's social and ideological formations. So he talks about how if you read Marx, we all understand like the question of enclosure sent the English peasants into the cities. It made peasants wage laborers. The act of primitive accumulation had to do with this noble seizure. And what I think happened in the early aughts was that the companies like Google, Apple, Meta, that were building allegedly a free universe of information and shareable information did something that was really incredible. And they did it with the help of the governments, which was they seized our mental health and subjectivity, our most intimate and primitive relations as their own possessions, so that all of our friends are on Facebook. Well, not for only old people now use Facebook. Our connections are on Instagram. Our entertainments and our dates are on Tinder or Grindr. And and he talks about, okay, I won't go into this. In the present state of American liberalism, the public-private boundary is increasingly blurred. In the period of high liberalism in the West, from 1789, I'm going to this is my historicization, to 1970, public authority was granted to those who could keep private suffering private. Today, American liberalism and its technological infrastructure demand confession and not reason in the public sphere. This is from this trauma book, which I'm criticizing, but it's like saying things are good, right? We're going to get to digital trauma studies, and that's like really good for digital trauma processing. I found this in a trauma studies textbook, right? So trauma itself becomes an object of professional knowledge, literary knowledge, and also digital possession. It is and in the trauma book, I'm going to argue that it is the, what do you call that? When you the secret code for it's the open sesame to the public sphere. What do you call it? cipher, what do you say when you say open sesame? What's that called? Password. Oh my God. Sometimes you lose a word and then you never get it back. Thank you. The password, our password into the public sphere. Dual login. So the performance of the self in the court society was oriented in the courtier's ability to please. The courtier's ability to please was based on two principles that built up to civilization, civilité, honnêteté and bienséance. Like the honnête homme, which we translate poorly as the honest man, is the civilized man. And bienséance means I know how to present myself well to please someone, but really in this painting, it is to please the king, please Louis, the absolute monarch. Now you have this the Habermasian, reading of the transition from the court to the coffee house has this idea. Of course, women are excluded, not working classes excluded, but within the sphere of the coffee houses, you have reason as the password, not pleasing a monarch, but your ability to argue, your ability to defend yourself, your ability to be informed. I think what he really neglects is a lot of the coffee house conversation was not just about, discussing the political reason of the day, but also about speculation and about gaining investors and ensuring ships to the colonies. And so it was all reason, speculation, but a certain kind of emotional impassivity and an ability to maintain control of one's affect was really important. It's different from the affect molding of the court. It's an evolution of the affect molding of the court. It is supposed to be democratizing because the Enlightenment says all human beings have equal access to reason. I mean, flawed as it was, it excluded women and people of different colors, but the projected arc of equality was that everyone who could exercise reason could participate in the public sphere in reasoned argument. So I already talked about this. Oh my God, I always go through this. The funny thing about the absolute monarchy is that women could be included, and women were excluded later in the coffee houses. So in under mercantile capitalism, we have the emergence of bourgeois society. I'm going to go through this too much, but liberal democracy grounded in industrial and then monopoly capitalism was based on this idea of the strict boundary. Mental disturbance and irrationality should be hidden from public view. The erosion of the public-private boundary established by the European bourgeoisie is taken for granted today and can be seen as a marker for the rise of Varoufakis's idea of techno-feudalism. So I'm going to go really quickly here. So the idea is that when you have under high liberalism, division of public and private, in techno-feudalism, you have this digital permeability of the public and private, of displaying and recognition. And one of the things that we're going to have to display all the time is trauma. And the first use of the word trauma, in the sense that we know it, comes from the railway accident in 1862. The railway accident medicalized this state of nervous shock that what someone would receive when they were in a railway accident. And the people who were in railway accidents were usually businessmen traveling on Britain's more and more extensive railway system. There were other industrial accidents that happened in factories, but they were not considered traumatic because they happened to working class people who were supposed to have less well-refined nervous systems. So trauma itself was always an anti-working class concept. And I found this confirmed because this 800-volume book comes out a couple of years ago, and it's still, trauma studies still performs this anti-working class function. Luckily, I have it on PDF. This is a book about all kinds of trauma, but it does not mention the trauma of the 2008 economic collapse. It doesn't mention the trauma of work. It doesn't mention the trauma of economic or labor situation at all. So in fact, trauma from the Industrial Revolution onward to the post-industrial age is still performing a certain kind of work for the bourgeoisie in order for it to cement its more virtuous, more refined nature? Is this actually a sign of being more civilized to be able to talk about your trauma? And Oprah Winfrey was the queen of this. She became a billionaire actually on being able to instrumentalize the erosion between the public and private life. Her most recent venture was an Apple TV series called The Me You Can't See. Her collaborator was Prince Harry. But also in terms of the visibility of minority figures, people of color, Chinese Americans, there's a new term that we have to use in order to be able to accede to the public sphere and become full citizens in this under techno-feudalism or LA capitalism, which is intergenerational trauma. That is the term that we have to embrace in order to become part of the culture industry's privileged subjects. So I was going to show you that these are slides I received from the UC Irvine Division of Teaching Excellence, where I am supposed to disrupt my educational system that it prioritizes knowing over caring, competition over collaboration, intervention over prevention. I can't get over the knowing versus over caring thing. I thought I spent all these years training myself, specializing in fields in order to become able to communicate knowledge. But now I realize I'm actually a bad person if I prioritize knowing over caring because I'm not using trauma-informed pedagogy. This is a form of enforced anti-intellectualism that on top of the other crises in higher education is now coming to us from directives in this administrative body, this Department of Division of Teaching Excellence, which keeps expanding and has nothing to do with teaching, very little to do with excellence, but has many administrators telling us what to do and making these bubble slides for us. Okay, I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to the incredible discipline of our three speakers, we have 18 minutes still to discuss. So the floor is open.
I think I'm boom, so for Zoom. Oh, okay, all right. This is for Filippo. If I understood you properly, are you saying that much of the barbarity that the philosophers criticized is actually more characteristic of early modernity than of the actual Middle Ages? Does that make sense?
Thank you for your question. I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I don't think that was my point. I mean, I think there is obviously a dark side of this kind of theorization of the Middle Ages as this unique 1,000 year in which barbarians are necessarily based on personal relationship. They have no law. They are the outcast of or the destroyers of the Roman Empire, which is considered in this narrative like as a positive force, right? So what I'm saying is that I want to invite us to complicate the narrative. I'm not necessarily saying that we should get rid of everything from modernity or everything from what I'm saying is that just the label barbarians, right? It's a label. It's like invasions of the barbarians. Those are not neutral words, right? It means that someone is invading, right? And the Roman Empire was expanding, right? So the lexicon is very revealing of how we shape our categories. So my intervention was actually an invitation to reflect upon these categories. So I'm not saying that those were the real barbarians, because it would be, I would say it would be ended up with the same narrative, right? And what I want to do is just offer a few additional insights, also because I've been going through, so mostly when they invited me to participate, I went through the footnotes of the Neo-Feudalism contributions, right? And those footnotes engage with a lot of historiography sometimes, but they quote people like Gibbon, for instance, right? That's an 18th century historian. And they're not quoting people who work on feudalism in the last decades, right? Contributing to complicating this notion. So also responding to the generous comments by Catherine, who has generously engaged thoroughly with my paper. So I'm grateful for that. I'm not trying to redeem feudalism, obviously. What I'm trying to do is showing that it's a complex category that's been used and it has a history. It has a history in which it's been applied to colonized spaces, imperialism, to voices that were considered as anti-modern, sometimes to hide some problematic sides also of the people that were using those categories. I don't know if I made myself clear, but
If I could follow up, I do Scandinavian, Nordic history. For me, feudalism is mostly about serfdom.
Yeah.
And serfdom began in the 18th century in Scandinavia.
Yeah.
18th century Denmark, Norway, Sweden were really quite a bit more barbaric than 15th or 14th century. So
yeah, I mean, of course, I'm not an expert on this, so you know, obviously better than I do. What I'm trying to say is, let's try to be more specific. If we're using neo-feudalism, where's feudalism? What's the evidence we're using, right? If we're defining the Middle Ages as something, let's put things in context, right? Because we've been talking a lot about feudalism, not feudalism, or Middle Ages or barbarians, but who were the barbarians? What do we mean exactly by using those categories, right? It doesn't mean that we should give up on using labels. It means that we should be aware of their history, and we should be able to back it up with evidence when we use such loaded terms. That's just my invitation, but thanks.
Hi, thank you all. I wanted to pose an open question to the panelists, which kind of crosses multiple talks, about the figure of the so-called Brahmin left that you introduced in your talk, Adam. I was surprised a little bit at where your critique of trauma, if I'm understanding you correctly, ended up, in that what I heard you saying was essentially that trauma is an anti-working class concept, and that essentially our notion of trauma was wrong, right? Or maybe not wrong, but unproductive in a way. And so I'm wondering, I guess the question I would pose, this is an open question, not a critical question, is it that, is the problem, if we can, even say this so generally, is the problem with kind of cultural production and affect molding right now that it exists in the first place? Or is the problem that it's the wrong kind of affect molding, that the competition for this notion of trauma, to weaponize this notion of trauma, is the wrong kind of thing? And if so, can you offer us the beginnings of a better way that we might, compete to be part of this Brahmin left? I don't know if this makes sense.
To compete, to be members of the Brahmin left? Well, I think that's what we would say, give up on that to begin with, because that is, prescribes already a kind of aristocratic, hierarchical way of being. I'm not prescriptive, but I'm saying that the contemporary professional classes have invented a new form of refinement in public language. Trauma is real. People really suffer, but it's the performance of it. Since 1990, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, in the rise of trauma studies, as it instrumentalized deconstruction and psychoanalysis. I don't want to go into all my theories because I don't want to plot spoil the book, but the idea is that it has become like a new language of sentiment and nervous system refinement that is about justifying the prerogatives of the Brahmin left, that we understand trauma better. They're those crude MAGA hat wearing people who can't even be traumatized because they're so backward and stupid, and they don't know that they don't feel pain. We feel pain. This has been something that the bourgeoisie has been really good at doing since the 18th century in the sentimental novel. And its notion of refinement of the nerves is something that I'm saying is inherited from the court nobility. So it's not a prescriptive thing. Remember, I'm negating only, not prescribing. Sorry. Here you
Is
go.
it my turn?
Well, if you want to say anything about the problem.
Well, and so with respect to cultural production, I will say as just like an anecdote, I graduated and I was actually looking at your slide. Well, first off, I will say Freud's theory of trauma was basically just analyzing rich people. So that in and of itself is course. But your slide about trauma in the 2000s and 2010s or whatever.
Oh, the Routledge companion.
Yeah. I was thinking back when I saw that slide, I was thinking back to where I was at that time, which I was in New York City, and I was trying to make it as in like the literary sort of scene. And it's so funny because I didn't have any kind of language to understand like trauma at that time. I wasn't really thinking about trauma, but I remember realizing instinctually that it was a form of cultural capital in particular for like prestigious literary, like the sort of literary salon scene, because I came from Ohio. I went to a state school. It was very unremarkable in pretty much every way, but I had this story about my dead father and my dead stepmother and like this very tragic thing. And suddenly I became like an interesting person to them. You know what I mean? And it was very like, oh, you're not just some random guy. Like you're kind of fucked up. That's cool. You know what I mean? And it was really, and I remember just thinking like, I can do something with this and like, let's write a memoir. You know what I mean? That was the whole thing. And I will say also, I'm working this wasn't included in my biography, but the book length project that I'm working on right now is about the relationship between working class literature, the history of working class literature, and the history of the creative writing program, which have been written about kind of separately. There's not a lot of scholarship on working class literature, but Mark McGurl did the Program Era, which is a great book. And he kind of touches on, class a little bit with Raymond Carver and stuff. But, to me, it seems evident that the sort of decline or disappearance of class as like a viable topic for popular, and in particular, like middle brow literature is because as a sort of cultural product, you think about who's producing them. It's primarily educated professionals who are being run through the BFA program, who are then kind of getting jobs as editors and as literary agents, and they're cultivating the kinds of concerns that they want, which are primarily like thinking about meaning as something intimate and personal, and not something public or social. And so I would say that trying to kind of, and what's interesting is that where you get the best class analysis right now is in genre fiction, which of course is still sort of bastardized in creative writing programs as being like I remember being in workshops. Yeah, I remember being in workshops and saying like having professors like literally say, you're not allowed to write sci-fi in this class, or like you can't, you have to write something. We're doing serious literature here. You know what I mean? So yeah. Thank you, though. It was good.
I have two quick. Check.
Two quick questions. One for the first presenter about the university. Insofar as it seems like the university, and it's to ask you to elaborate a little bit on where you ended your talk.
Oh, okay.
Insofar as the presentation, not just now. Insofar as it does seem, and according to your narrative, I was convinced that the university is caught between these fundamentally contradictory imperatives to produce an ideological legitimation for the extant order in the form of the ideology of merit, and is there to produce class structure and reproduce class hierarchy, class domination. And it seems that the narrative you're telling is about the increasing divergence between these two projects. So my question is, it seems like insofar as there is a contradiction there, at some point it's professed commitment to, or it's professed commitment to merit and its real commitment to reproducing of class can't be sustained indefinitely. And it strikes me that there's space perhaps for a reactionary mobilization on the basis of that contradiction, or an emancipatory mobilization. So I'm curious, to what extent do you, if I wanted you to hum a few more bars really about the end of your talk about how you see the sustainability of this contradiction and what it might entail in the future, unsustainability of the contradiction. And then my question to Professor Liu, I was thinking about LES and techno-feudalism a little bit myself, and I don't know it that well, but my understanding is there's an element about how this public-private distinction is in part, he has a bit of a Freudian story about repression of instinct, sublimation of instinct, things like that. So I'm curious whether there's a way to connect that to the techno-feudalism, where the fusion of the public and private can be a story not just about the professional managerial class and these trauma narratives, but also about things like the alt-rights or the sort of the desublimation of sex and violence on the internet, and the return of sort of fascist sensibilities, that there's a way in which that itself is a sort of repressive desublimation, to use a Marcuse type term, that could be linked up to this Elias story about public and private, and about repression and civility norms and things like that. So I'm curious if that's something that resonates with your work.
No, it looks okay.
So thinking about the future of higher ed.
What did they do?
The sort of competing projects. I mean, yeah, I have zero faith in like higher education as like an institution anymore. I think, you know, a lot of this emerged, a lot of this research emerged when I was writing a piece on who was it now? Which was the college that very proudly ended legacy admissions? Wellesley, or which was the super rich one? No. Was it? I thought Wesleyan. I think it was Wesleyan. And I remember looking at, like, you know, and they were very proud of the fact that that they got rid of legacy admissions, which, you know, that's fair. Legacy admissions are stupid, but it's also like the idea that legacy admissions is the problem is a laughable analysis when, you know, like 60% of the student body comes from the top 1% of family income earners, right? Like that's not, you know, that's not really the problem. And I think, you know, I currently adjunct, and I didn't even get into like the sort of the stratification of like contingent labor versus full-time labor, you know, and there are times when I think about, like, you know, I get paid, what is it? $905 per credit hour. So, and they cap you at 9 credit hours, because anything more would be considered full-time, and they don't want to have to pay you full-time, and that's how it works. So it comes out to like $8,100 a semester. And then, so it's like I teach 75 students a semester. So one student already ostensibly would cover my entire semester of earnings, right? So where does all that money go? But insofar as thinking about the sort of emancipatory question, I mean, I sort of welcome the idea that, like, I mean, I'm tempted to do sort of a polemical, like, you know, abolish the university kind of a thing. Like, this isn't like a anti-intellectual project or something, because I think that knowledge is good, and I think that learning is great, and, you know, I love caring is better. It is. Yeah, I think we should care for each other more. We have to care about texts, really, is what we have to do. I think, you know, I love literature, and I love film, and I love the arts, and I love the humanities in a lot of ways. But I also think that, like, if we're really serious with like what we're doing in the humanities, like, I understand why nobody gives a shit, and I understand why no one wants to fund it anymore. And in a certain sense, it's like, if that's what must be the case for like this sort of you know, it's not really a caste system, but like a, you know, what would you call? And yeah, I mean, I guess my takeaway is I kind of welcome the end of higher education as it is structured now. I don't think it would be a bad thing. I think it would be a good thing in the long run, at least for working people. But of course, for people who are in the system, like, they cling to it because it's the thing that allows them to basically, it kind of justifies, you know, their own existence and what they do. I know that's kind of like a hot take or something, but I don't know. I guess that's where I am thinking about like the sort of future of things. Because I mean, if you imagine a labor market where like you don't need a degree, like ostensibly, I mean, right now a lot of people with degrees are not getting jobs in their fields anyways, but if that were actually completely eliminated from the equation, I don't know. It seems like it would be a better situation.
Can we interject with one last comment and then we'll probably have to.
Okay, just very quickly, my question is also for you. You were talking about basically universities, and you were talking about university administrators squeezing every penny out of the students and so on, but while not being capitalist managers. But I just thought I would tell you that from my limited knowledge, there is now increasingly a revolving door between the private sector, where you can be a big high earning CEO, and a university president or vice chancellor or whatever you call them. And therefore their ability to increase revenues, plus give all sorts of lucrative contracts from public or semi-public or philanthropically funded institutions or institutions with big endowments, give lucrative contracts to big corporations, becomes the way in which they qualify themselves for private sector jobs later. So I think that we shouldn't forget that. And secondly, you didn't mention the role of foreign students, increasingly important in earning the big bucks that universities are making now.
Yeah, it also adds to the seat scarcity, because more and more spots are reserved for international students who pay a lot.
I wanted to comment on the sublimation, desublimation thing, because I think it is really important. Elias is a Freudian, and he does say that there are certain processes of the body that get civilized. And he's not, like Freud, he's not against civilization, right? And for instance, Erasmus tells the prince not to pee against walls, not to use the same spoon as his predecessor, to wipe the cup as he's passing it down the table. And he says, this tells us what life was like before, the civilizing process really kicks into gear. But I find that there is a punitive, sadistic aspect to the civilizing process within the liberal institutions as they've been managed by the liberal professional classes. And they're about punishing your apperception. So it's not even about repression, it's about punishment of apperceptive reactions to people, so that we don't know how, so that every intersubjective relationship can be managed by an app, every moment of anxiety can be managed by a drug, and and every moment of encounter with the other has to be smoothed over by a prescriptive identity marker. So there was like Nancy Fraser wrote that essay, Recognition or Redistribution, right? And I think she gave way too much to recognition. And so we have a pure economy of mutual recognition, no redistribution. And this is the ideological veil that we live under. And there's a sadistic aspect to the demands of a civilizing process that does not have equality at its end, but this hypervisibility for everyone. Because I think in the end, the governing principles of the court society were about ruling well. And then in the public sphere, the governing principle was equality, right? For those forms of political economy. And right now we have the governing principles of the public sphere now for the liberals are mutual recognition, but exclusion of the other. And I definitely think that the alt-right, the rise of this kind of, Trumpism or this kind of very extreme conservatism is a reaction to this kind of policing without a utopic end that liberalism has become.
Okay, thank you very much. This was a great panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists. So we'll have a 10-minute pause. There's still a lot of pastries and coffee around, and we'll be back in 10 minutes for our political economy panel. Thanks.